Welcome back, everyone. It's John Wade Boggs fan. Well, about a week ago, Mike, baseball collector, did what I thought was a very good video on some of the theories or concepts, economic concepts that may be in play in this current crazy sports card market. And he touched upon three areas. One of them was the wealth effect. The other one was found money, and then the big money investors. And Mike was taking a look at this from an economics background, at least for the first two. And I didn't realize he majored in economics. Turns out I majored in economics as well in college. I didn't go down the same career path that Mike did. I basically am a small business lender, but regardless, I have that economic background as well. And while I applauded Mike and said he did a great job with those sort of economic theories, the one thing that he didn't point out, and maybe because he thought it was obvious, but it's to the point of this video here, is underlying everything that he talked about is the basic concept of supply and demand. And I know that's been thrown out as part of different discussions, and you probably heard that phrase before. Oh, so it's just an issue of supply and demand. Well, I don't know if all of you have a true concept of what that is, or more important, and what I'm going to hopefully show here visually, what that supply and demand looks like, and how changes in supply and or demand in a perfect economic world results in changes in prices. And so I'm going to do my best here to put my professor hat on. So I don't know how well this is going to go, so bear with me here. And I do understand that I may not get a lot of views on this video because, quite frankly, I'll be honest with you, economics is not that exciting. Unless you're really into it, it's boring. I equate it to watching golf on TV. If you're not a golfer and can appreciate what these players are doing on the golf course, golf is extremely boring to watch on TV. I admit it. I occasionally turn on, flip the channels. I see a golf tournament on TV. I'll watch a little bit because I know what's going on, and I know how they make it look easy on the golf course. But for the general sports fan, golf is extremely boring. So I understand I'm going to be doing this and maybe not getting many videos. And this video may tend to go a little bit long here because I want to explain different concepts, both looking at, I'm going to look at what happened with Project 2020. I'm going to take a look at modern cards and vintage cards. And so, I'm just going to go into it. So here we are. Let's start off here. And basically, this is the chart that is basically used to show supply and demand. So we have a chart here where P is price. So lower price here, higher price up here. And Q is quantity. Okay, amount of cards or that we're talking about here. But in general speaking, quantity of a product or thing. So low quantity, high quantity. So the supply curve has a general shape of going up like this. And the theory is that if you're a manufacturer of something, that if you can get a price here, you'll maybe produce this amount of goods. If you can get a higher price, you're going to want to try to produce more to maximize your return and profits and so on. So a supply curve generally goes this direction. Okay, so now we have the demand curve. So the demand curve is more going down. That's how I always remember it in econ classes. Supply going up, D down for the demand curve. And here what it's saying is when prices are high, consumers generally, again, these are general theories, okay, that they're not going to buy as many of a certain product. As the price goes down and becomes quote unquote more affordable, they'll buy more. Okay. So what that is when you combine the supply and demand curve, all else being equal in a perfect environment, which there hardly ever is a perfect environment, but you have an intersection here. And that is sort of like a market stabilizing price and quantity. All right. Now, as I mentioned, sports cards are different. All right. For any particular card, there is a finite supply. All right. Whether we're talking about how many 1952 Topps Mickey Mantles are still around, or how many Topps 2021 Series 1 cards are produced of a particular player. There's a finite supply or quantity. Okay, so it's pretty much a straight line, but we'll see how that may change a little bit. But generally speaking, it's an up and down line for supply, right? So now let's look at a low supply. So you have a serial numbered card out of 50. Okay, well, that has a low quantity available in the marketplace. So for a standard demand, generally speaking, you're going to see fairly high prices for that card because while people would love to pay down here and buy this many of them, there are only that many available. All right, so you'll generally see higher prices for lower serial numbered cards versus non-serial numbered cards, which may have a supply line down here. All right, and conversely, I won't use the word J, but cards that were overproduced in the late 80s, early 90s had a huge supply. There are a ton of them out there. Generally speaking, with that same demand curve of the market, people aren't going to pay much for those cards because there are so many out there. All right. So again, with the relatively same amount of demand for sports cards, the supply has an effect on the price. And I think, again, if you think about it, this makes sense. All right, so let's look at Project 2020. Now, Topps produced a certain amount of a card based on the number of orders. So if there are only this many orders, then the supply line would be here. If there were a lot more orders, the supply line would go here. Okay. But let's say I just picked sort of like an average, okay? So you have a supply and demand, and it was right there. Initially, that may be at the price that Topps was offering it on their website. Okay? I mean, you would think that if there was a certain demand with the supply, it matched up. Okay? Well, what happened is over time, the demand for these cards went up. So whenever you see an increase or decrease in the supply or demand, you get a shifting of the line. Okay, so it sort of moves up or down, or here, in this case, left or right. All right, so for any given print run of Topps 2020, when the demand for that card in the secondary market went up, the prices went up. So you saw movement going from there up to there. All right. Now, what happened with Project 2020 is for the next card release, when it got to the height where the bubble was almost ready to burst, the the next release, people wanted more of them. So the supply line moved over here. Then the next release, the supply line moved over here. Then for the next release and so on until you got to, what was it, the Shore Griffey, where it shifted, the supply shifted so much, even with the demand going up a little bit. So if that line was a little bit lower, okay, but the supply here, line was here, you saw a drop in price. And then compound to that, people were like, oh my gosh, the world's ending, the bubble burst, let's get out. The demand for those cards went down. Everyone started dumping. So you saw a reversal in the demand for a particular supply of a card. So one particular Project 2020 card that had X number made, you had the demand for that. People were bailing out, getting, selling, hopefully at whatever profit they could take or whatever. And you saw the demand curve go back. So then prices went from here down to there. And for those really high production cards, you saw it even drop further. So graphically, that's what happened with Project 2020. So now let's look at modern graded cards. And I specifically decided to look at graded cards for a reason. Because as I said, for any given card, there's a finite that have been produced, no matter what card you're talking about, serial numbered, non-serial numbered. Vintage cards, there are a certain number that have existed and haven't been thrown away or whatever. So in the market, they're not making any more 1952 Topps Mickey Mantles. They're just not. They're not making any more 2020 Topps cards anymore. All right. So we have your standard supply and demand. All right. Now you have an increase in the demand for graded cards. All right, so you saw that over the last year and a half. Everything seems to be moving with the modern cards to graded, and the demand for the number of cards that have a certain population of graded, say a PSA 10 of Mike Trout. Okay, at any given time, there's a certain supply, and when the demand goes up, again, you're going to see prices going from here up to there. But what is also playing an effect here is that as people start seeing the demand and the prices go up, they're starting to submit more and more to PSA and to Beckett. Hence the fact that PSA still has, I don't even know what their backlog is, but it's a huge backlog. All right. Now, over the last year, there have been some that have been graded, come back, and entered in the market. So not only do you have a increase in demand, but the supply of graded cards, again, not the supply of the raw card, but the ones that are graded, have gone up as well. So you have a dual action of increase in demand, but also increase in supply. And if that supply outpaces the demand, you may get an initial increase in price up from here to here, but over time, as you increase the availability or the supply of PSA 10 Mike Trouts to where they're all over the place, you can, everyone has one for sale. You go on eBay and you see a ton of listings for PSA 10 Mike Trout rookie cards. Eventually, you're going to see a decline in price. Now, will it still be higher than it was down here? Yes. Okay. But you're going to see some easing of the prices that they go for, even though demand is strong. The fact that you've added more to the supply brings it down. All right. Now, let's, heaven forbid, now we're not talking about Mike Trout here, but let's say we have some other rookies, or some other cards of modern players. Let's say, so we'll go on a little like journey here. So you first had the supply and demand here. demand increased, so brought prices up here of that hot rookie or young player or whatever. Collectors said, hey, there's money to be made in these graded cards. I'm going to submit more to PSA. They start getting graded and come back and enter the market and come here. Prices go down a little bit. Now let's say that player has a terrible year, gets sent down to the minors, heaven forbid has an injury. Someone new comes along and grabs all the attention, and you see it more in modern cards, especially these rookies, where I'm just gonna, a name just popped into my head, like George Springer or maybe some of the Astros, that after the whole World Series playoff accusations and stuff, people didn't want those cards anymore, so the demand went down. So now you can see, again, prices were here, the demand went up. Now their graded cards are going for a lot of money. People start grading more of those raw cards, entering more graded into the market, and then you have a demand decrease in that player, and that's where you see graded cards, in theory, for a particular player that's no longer has any hobby interest or whatever, plummet to where they were starting off. All right. So now let's look at vintage. Again, starting off with the same supply demand curve and intersection here. Okay. Again, vintage graded, the demand has been going up, so you see an increase in price. Again, same thing with modern, same thing with Project 2020. But the one difference here is, while there are more cards available to be graded, and this has no, I don't have any data to back this up, so this is just a guess on my part, or a feeling on my part, that the majority of cards being submitted for graded are modern versus vintage. I'm sure there are new vintage cards getting submitted for grading. Okay, I'm not saying that there aren't any, but compared to modern, I think there's less vintage. Okay, so with that assumption, you start seeing an increase in demand, moving the price up here. The supply of new graded cards entering the market doesn't increase that much. Okay, so for vintage, you're pretty much trading within the same quantity that's available. All right, so even then, as you get a couple more, if you have a fairly low pop card, graded card, vintage card, and 2, 3, 4, 5 more get graded and enter the market, you may see a little bit of a softening of the price that they go for, because they're a little bit more available, but they're still very high because the demand has risen. All right. I also think that the chance that the demand for vintage, for either particular player set, you name it, is not as volatile, and I'll talk about that term volatility in a minute here, but I don't necessarily see a huge, at any point in time, a huge drop in demand for vintage. There's not really going on with the vintage players. Again, they're done with their career. I just don't see a market force to say, oh, geez, I no longer want to collect Jackie Robinson cards. I don't see, if you're a diehard baseball fan, even if you're into modern or whatever, I don't see that there would be a huge drop in demand at any point in time. Okay, so even if there is, again, you could still see some softening of the price, but it's still relatively high. Okay. Now, again, here is just sort of like a summary of the modern supply and demand. Okay, so you have, again, starting here, demand going up, increase in supply, and demand going down. Okay, This is what now. This is not an economic term or theory. It's sort of something that I just made up just to explain what I'm talking about here. But I personally call this area sort of like the area of volatility, and this is based on potentials. Okay, so again, for modern, you may have a starting point of here, and the way modern cards are going and everyone getting on the bandwagon of, hey, Juan Soto is going to be the next greatest thing, and everyone who collects modern is starting to go after Juan Soto rookies, right? So the demand, the change is going to be pretty dramatic, all right? Which means price is going from here to here. At the same time, there are a fair number of raw cards that as people start seeing these prices, they're going to say, hey, I want to start submitting these. I want to see how many PSA 10s I can get and so on, which would bring the supply out in the market, have potentially a big swing in supply. Then heaven forbid a particular player loses favor in the market for collectability and their demand plummets, which again has that opportunity. You're looking at a pretty big area here where prices could go up or down. And this is why, again, I personally think modern cards are, especially for some of these rookies or very young players, even current pitchers, okay, have a large area of volatility where, based on, again, forces of supply and demand, you could see prices going way up or they could come crashing down, right? So here is the area of volatility for graded cards. And as you can see in my example, again, this is not perfect, but in my example here, the area of volatility is a lot smaller because, one, the chances of the market getting flooded with a huge increase in supply of a particular card. Now, again, I'm not talking about all graded cards. Every single chart here is based on one particular card at a time. Okay, name your card, you can use that chart for it, right? So for a particular vintage card, there doesn't seem to be a rush to have a ton of them graded. Are there going to be some more graded? Yes. That hit the market? Yes, but not big. At the same time, I don't see a big, huge decrease in demand at any point in time. So the range of potential prices is a lot smaller. All right. So there you have it. Oh, I'm going to get back here. Okay. So there you have it. That's my little economics course, I guess, for you, explaining the basis of everything that goes on in not only the sports card market, but gasoline, the price of milk. I mean, you name it. Every product out there at its core is based on supply and demand and changes, whether market driven, maybe forced by government actions, subsidies, a whole range of things change the supply and demand at any given point in time. Sometimes on a daily basis. In the matter of stock market, it's on a minute basis. I mean, it within a trading day, that supply is fixed because you have a fixed number of shares, but the demand changes within a particular day multiple times, and that's how you get stock prices going up and down. The only time the supply changes is if a stock does a 2-for-1 stock split. Then there are twice as many numbers of shares, but then again, a 2-for-1 stock split, your price is pretty much immediately cut in half. So, like I said, if you've lasted this long in this video, I give you 2 thumbs up because it's pretty nerdy, but I find it interesting, again, because of my background. But again, and I'm going to leave a link to Mike's video in the description of this video, because if you haven't seen it, especially after listening to this, It's a really good video going beyond this supply and demand and what other factors are out there. Again, this wealth effect that Mike talks about, and it's real. It may be all up here, but it's real. And found money, of course, everyone knows. If you find extra money that you didn't expect to have, and you're like, hey, let me spend on some baseball cards, that has an effect. And of course, the big money investors, baseball cards are now, or sports cards now, are the it thing, and that's a whole other area, and Mike talks about that as well. So again, I appreciate you sticking around this long, and so let's start wrapping this video up with the trivia. So last video, I switched things up a little bit, and instead of doing a sort of a factoid, I did a quote, and wanted to see if you knew who said the quote. And a few of you got it. A lot of you said Ted Williams, which, after I read the quote again, I can definitely would see that it could have been him, but it wasn't. But let me read the quote here, and then I'll tell the answer. So the quote was, "I think about baseball when I wake up in the morning. I think about it all day, and I dream about it at night. The only time I don't think about it is when I'm playing it." And the person who said that was Carl Yastrzemski. Yep. So for those who guessed Ted Williams, you had the right team. You had an all-time Red Sox great. You just picked the wrong one. So it was Carl Yastrzemski. So, all right, to finish this video up, I'm going to go back to a normal trivia question for this video. And of course, I'll have the answer for you in my next video. But the question is, what all-time postseason record did Daniel Murphy set during the Mets' run to the World Series in 2015? Now, being a Mets fan, and again, in addition to the Red Sox fan, but in the National League, 2015 was a very good year for me. It was a very exciting year. Really disappointed that I had a feeling they were just going to lose steam to, I think it was the Kansas City Royals. But at any rate, they had a magical postseason, and I remember the exploits of Daniel Murphy. And let me tell you, he was hot in the postseason. Anyway, so what was the all-time record that Daniel Murphy set during the 2015 postseason for the Mets? Again, I'll have the answer for you in my next video. As always, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.